Welcome back, everyone, to another reaction video. Well, I just finished a fantastic book by one of my favorite authors when it comes to medieval history, and that is Dan Jones. He just had a book that came out a while back about Henry V, England's great warrior king, one of the greatest kings in the history of Britain. And it was a fantastic story. I learned a ton, and I thought this would be a great time to dive into a little bit of the story of Henry V. Most people know him because of Shakespeare, which is kind of a not completely truthful version of Henry V, which then spawned a movie that came out on Netflix not long ago, starring Timothy Chalamet as Henry V, which is based on the Shakespeare version and therefore also not completely correct. So this gives us a chance today to take a look at the story of Henry V and talk about the real history, talk about the real person, because it's a fascinating story and it's an integral part of the history of England and Britain and the future United Kingdom. So as we dive into this one, the link will be in the description. We're going to be taking a look at Biographics because they have a video on this topic. I did a little browsing to see who all did a video on Henry V that we could take a look at, and this seemed to be the best option. So links down in the description if you want to check it out without my commentary. I want to thank Trent in Covington, Pennsylvania, who signed up as a patron a couple of weeks ago. Trent, thank you so much. I am excited. I'm going to be announcing some new perks for our patrons and a few changes to our Patreon system in the coming weeks, so be watching for that. I'll let you know as I am able to. Let's dive in.
King Henry V, too famous to live long, England ne'er lost a king of so much worth.
Yeah, I mean, that opening quote is just so powerful because Henry V, if there's ever a what if for me in history, it's what if Henry V doesn't die in his mid-30s. If he lives another 10, 15 years, the whole history of Western Europe is completely different.
Those are the immortal words of William Shakespeare, used to describe our subject in today's video. King Henry V had a short life and an even shorter reign, so why is he remembered as one of England's greatest monarchs? 3 simple words: Battle of Agincourt. Widely considered one of England's greatest victories.
Yeah, that's part of it, but the Battle of Agincourt is part of a much larger overall, I mean, it's part of the 100 Years' War, and specifically it's the part where England pretty much wins the 100 Years' War, only to see it completely unravel at the end of Henry's life and then after he's dead.
Against its perennial enemy, France, it turned the tide in the 100 Years' War and poised Henry to become the dual monarch of both nations.
Yep.
Whether or not this actually happens, well, let's find out as we explore the life and the reign of Henry V.
Now, keep an eye on that image because you notice that it shows him from the side, and there's a really important reason why that I'm sure we're going to get into.
Henry was born at Monmouth Castle in the Welsh town of the same name, hence why he is also commonly known as Henry of Monmouth. Strangely enough, nobody's really sure when he was born. Although we know that he eventually became king, he was not in the line of succession at first, so nobody bothered to record his birth in the official records. The 2 most frequently used dates are September the 16th, 1386, and August the 9th, 1387. Henry was the eldest of 6 children to Henry Bolingbroke and Mary de Bohun. His mother died in 1394 after giving birth to her final child, while his father took the throne of England by force from his cousin Richard II and became King Henry IV in the...
Yeah, so the names you often see with these people, Henry of Monmouth, Henry Bolingbroke, John of Gaunt, who is Henry Bolingbroke's father, these all are to distinguish them from all the myriad other people with the same first names at a time when members of royalty didn't necessarily have surnames. I know we used the term Plantagenet for the dynasty, but it wasn't like they called themselves, he didn't call himself Henry Plantagenet. This is something we've applied to them later on. So we distinguish for the sake of history these people by giving them the names of the places they were born.
1399. Once his father ascended to the throne, he named Henry of Monmouth as his heir and granted him several titles such as Prince of Wales and Duke of Lancaster.
So let's do a little bit of real quick background on this. So Edward III is monarch for a long time. He oversees the beginning stages of the 100 Years' War, wins a great battle at Crécy in the 1340s, claims the French throne. And that's a complicated story in and of itself. And we did a video on Edward III where we talk a lot about that. But Edward III, after a long reign, he dies, but he dies shortly after the Prince of Wales, a guy we know as the Black Prince. Again, a title that wasn't used during his lifetime, but we apply to him later on. And so when Edward the Black Prince dies, and then his father, Edward III, dies soon after, it's the Black Prince's son, Richard, who becomes king as a child. So Richard II is on the throne, and he has some really good moments, but he has some really bad moments, and the further along you get into his reign, the worse and worse it gets. And he makes some really critical errors in dealing with some of the nobles, in particular Henry Bolingbroke, who is his first cousin. Edward's father, the Black Prince, and Henry Bolingbroke's father, John of Gaunt, were brothers. They were both sons of Edward III. Henry Bolingbroke is not the next in line. He's not the direct heir of Richard II. He takes the throne by right of conquest. He comes in with an army after he's been exiled, and he takes the throne. And so there's always this shadow that hangs over Henry IV, and he deals with continual threats to his reign, rebellions, things like that. And so everybody's looking forward to the time when Henry V is going to take the throne, because he will inherit from his father, and that stain of usurper will be mostly gone.
Although he did not expect it, Henry embraced his new role, considering it his destiny to one day rule over England and conquer France. He was enthusiastic when it came to learning all aspects of government, but he was absolutely enthralled when it came to military matters. That being said, he was still a young man, one with absolute wealth, power, and privilege, and he'd like to use them to his advantage when it came to letting his hair down. Several medieval sources described Henry as being somewhat of a party boy in his youth, or an assiduous cultivator of lasciviousness to...
There is some of that, but the majority of the sources that I'm aware of describe Henry as a pretty stand-up guy, a pretty solid guy. He did have some moments, especially toward the end of his father's reign, where he fell into some of that, but a lot of that's a Shakespeare invention to really focus on how Prince Hal, as he calls him, is kind of a party boy and falls out of favor with his dad late in his father's life. That part's kind of true. But Henry's a warrior, and he is a faithful servant to his father, and by all accounts does a pretty good job as heir to the throne.
Use contemporary parlance. However, it seems that he got over his wild teenage phase pretty fast. By the time he ascended to the throne, he was better known for his piety than his partying. From a young age, it became clear that Henry was a skilled warrior and commander. His father, King Henry IV, not only encouraged his son's interest in all things military, but practically demanded it. He knew that all the books and training in the world were no substitute for the real thing, so he thrust his son into the heat of battle from an early age. This was partially done out of necessity, since King Henry IV had to contend with several rebellions during his reign, and he needed all the good commanders that he could get his hands on. Prince Henry of Monmouth distinguished himself at the Battle of Shrewsbury in 1403 when he was only 16 years old against his former guardian and teacher, Sir Henry Hotspur Percy. Although Hotspur,
my 19th great-grandfather, I know hundreds of thousands of other people are descended from Hotspur too. So there is a rebellion going on by a Welsh Prince of Wales named Owen Glyndwr, and he is constantly kind of a threat on the Welsh border over to the west of England, and so they're dealing with that. And the Percy family, they are the Earls of Northumberland, and they are responsible for kind of the northern border. The Percys are the powerful northern magnate to kind of protect the border with Scotland against incursions by Scotland. And Percy is the son of the current Earl of Northumberland, who I think his name was also Henry Percy, but it might be a different first name. So when Hotspur has this rebellion in 1403, he's doing so while still the heir to his father's earldom of Northumberland. And Henry of Monmouth, the future Henry V, takes an arrow to the face. It embeds 6 inches into his skull, and he fights for another half hour with this arrow. After he takes his arrow to the face, they pull it out, and it leaves the arrowhead embedded 6 inches into his skull. And they call this... maybe I'm getting ahead of myself. Maybe he'll talk about it.
Henry IV and helped him seize power from Richard II. He eventually rebelled and managed to amass a large army of people who wanted the king gone from the throne. The battle turned into a decisive victory for King Henry IV after Hotspur was killed in battle, but the king almost lost his heir when Prince Henry of Monmouth was injured in battle. And this wasn't any paper cut either. The 16-year-old Henry nearly died after being shot in the head with a freaking arrow. When he was brought to the hospital, Henry still had the arrow embedded deep in his skull, but he made a miraculous recovery thanks to the royal surgeon John Bradmore. And as a unique treat, Bradmore not only managed to save the prince's life, but also wrote a treatise detailing his treatment, which still survives to this day.
Yeah, that's remarkable, and one of my favorite things about this story is that Bradmore wrote in detail exactly how he extracted this arrowhead from 6 inches buried deep in a 16-year-old prince's skull. Now, Bradmore was in prison when all this went down for counterfeiting or something like that. It was completely unrelated to medical things. And he's known to be the best surgeon in the country, and so they pull him out of prison to treat the prince, and when the prince recovers, Bradmore's given a full pardon.
Here is how the surgeon described the ordeal. The son and heir was struck by an arrow next to his nose on the left side during the Battle of Shrewsbury. The arrow entered at an angle, and the head of the aforesaid arrow remained in the furthermost part of the bone of the skull for the depth of 6 inches. First, I made small probes from the pith of an elder, well-dried and well-stitched in putrefied linen, the length of the wound. These probes were infused with rose honey, and after that I made larger and longer probes so that I continued to always enlarge these probes until I had the width and depth of the wound as I wished. And after, I prepared anew some tongs, small and hollow, and with these, the width of an arrow, I put these tongs in at an angle in the same way as the arrow had first entered, then placed the screw in the center, and finally the tongs entered the socket of the arrowhead. Then, by moving it to and fro, little by little, I extracted the arrowhead. And then I cleansed the wound with a syringe full of white wine, and placed in new probes made of wads of flax soaked in a cleansing ointment, and from the second day I shortened the said wads every 2 days, and thus within 20 days the wound was perfectly well cleansed.
Yes, this is all remarkable stuff, and it's not all that dissimilar from how big open wounds can be treated today. You clean it, you make sure that it's disinfected the best you can, which of course they didn't understand infection the way we do today, and then you pack it and allow it to heal from the inside out, and that reduces the scarring. Now, he says that it was on the left side of the face, but a lot of the images we have of Henry show him at profile only showing the left side, and so there's speculation that maybe when he was talking about the left side, what he meant was when he's looking at Henry, it's on the left side, which would have been the right side of Henry's face, and that's why we always see the profile of Henry from the left.
And afterwards I regenerated the flesh with a dark ointment. And note that I always anointed him on the neck every day in the morning and evening with an ointment to soothe the muscles, and placed a hot plaster on top on account of fear of spasm, which was my greatest fear. And thus, thanks to God, it was perfectly cured.
Remarkable. Remarkable.
As you might imagine, taking an arrow to the face in the middle of a battle and living to talk about it earned Henry some serious bragging rights with his...
And not just living to talk about it, but he continued to fight for a half hour after taking the arrow to the face until he was finally removed from the field.
Soldiers. This was his first fight, and already the prince developed a reputation as a mighty warrior, even with the dorky bowl haircut that he tended to sport. And it didn't take long before Prince Henry was back in the saddle, both figuratively and literally, ready to take part in his next conflict. This one wasn't so easily solved, though. In 1400, the Welsh leader Owain Glyndŵr instigated a revolt with the goal of ending English rule in Wales. He turned into a formidable foe who kept King Henry IV busy for years to come.
And fighting alongside him are some brothers with the last name Ap Tudor, who will come into play a little bit later on the Lancastrian side.
In a way, even bested him as he sapped all the energy from the English king, who felt his body begin to fail him even though he was still in his late 30s. As a result of this, Henry of Monmouth started taking a more active role in his father's government, aided by his uncles. With free reign, the prince decided to switch tactics when it came to dealing with Glyndŵr. Instead of the traditional raids and skirmishes, he adopted a war of attrition by setting up garrisons in strategic locations to cut off his enemy's supply routes. This forced the Welsh leader Glinda to retreat into his main strongholds, which Henry then attacked with siege weapons. Meanwhile, he also offered pardons to Glinda's allies, many of which took them when they saw the tide turning against them. In 1409, Glinda lost his last bastion of safety, Harlech Castle, and was forced to retreat into the mountains. From there, he conducted the occasional raid, but he wasn't a serious threat anymore.
Yeah, he's still out there, and he's still kind of a problem even when Henry becomes king, but he's not the major threat anymore, and this is enough to allow Henry then to focus on other threats. In the meantime, as he mentioned, Henry IV is in failing health. There's a while there where they're pretty sure he's going to die, and they're able to kind of wrest power from him, and there's a lot of politics going on with all of this, where they set up a council to make decisions on the king's behalf. The king has these half-brothers, the Beauforts, who are from John of Gaunt's originally illegitimate match with a woman late in life, but eventually those Beauforts are all legitimized with the idea that they can never inherit anything, and it's through that Beaufort line you're eventually going to get Henry Tudor. But we're getting way ahead of ourselves.
When Glinda disappeared completely from the historical record in 1412, and his ultimate fate remains a mystery. It's said that only his direct descendants know the location of his final resting place, and they're not in a sharing mood. As far as Henry of Monmouth was concerned, he impressed a lot of people with his military and ministerial skills, despite his young age. By 1410, the prince had become the de facto ruler of the country as the commander of the royal council, but he soon found himself at odds with his father. The two of them disagreed over policies, specifically when it came to France, and although the prince had his supporters, his father was still the king, and his word was final.
Yeah, the problem that's going on here is that in France you have a king who is suffering from bouts of insanity. They call him Charles the Mad, and you have two factions that develop. You almost have a civil war going on in France. You have this guy John the Fearless on one side, and you have the king's side. And what happens is that Henry of Monmouth, the Prince of Wales, sides with one side, but then his father sides with the other side. And so you have two factions within England helping the two different factions within France. It's all super complicated, but really fascinating.
Fed up with his son's eager and rebellious nature, King Henry IV dismissed him from the council entirely in 1411. However, he did not take any more drastic steps, such as naming a new heir. This meant that for the prince, it simply became a waiting game, one that didn't take very long. On March the 20th, 1413, Henry IV's unknown affliction finally claimed his life after years of poor health. The following month, Henry IV was crowned the new King of England. Now that Henry was the man in charge, he adopted a conciliatory approach. Let bygones be bygones, he thought, as he wanted to rule over a united nation and also move away from his father's legacy, as many regarded him as a bit of a tyrant.
Yeah, and not only that, but Henry had seen what Richard II had done wrong early on. One of the things that led to Richard II's fall is the way in which he dealt with the powerful nobles of his kingdom, doing things like exiling the future Henry IV. And when Henry IV, when his father John of Gaunt, the Duke of Lancaster, dies, Henry is not allowed to come back and claim his rightful place as Duke of Lancaster. And so then he comes back with an army and says, hey, I'm just here to claim what's rightfully mine, and then he claims the throne. And there's a lot of other instances of that. So Henry V is realizing that he needs to learn from the mistakes of his predecessors, Richard II, Henry IV, and how he deals with contention and discord. But he's also not above not giving people over and over and over again second, third, fourth, fifth chances. I'll give you a second chance, but after that, don't expect it again.
Henry restored titles and properties to many noblemen who had been dispossessed by his father, chief among them Edmund Mortimer, who had been imprisoned for allying himself with Henry Hotspur Percy. Mortimer had been heir presumptive to King Richard II, so he would have ruled England if Henry IV had not taken power by force. Even now, he still had the second strongest claim to the throne after Henry V, so...
And it's through Mortimer... Partially through Mortimer, you're going to eventually get the Yorkist claim to the throne. You're going to have the Wars of the Roses between the descendants of Henry IV and the descendants of Edmund Mortimer.
It was a big gamble on behalf of the new king to release Edmund Mortimer from prison, let alone restore his old authority. Fortunately for Henry, the gamble paid off. Mortimer knew not to bite the hand that fed him. Instead of fighting again over the top position and possibly dying or ending up in prison once more, Mortimer's okay with playing second fiddle and became one of Henry's most trusted counselors. He remained loyal even after the king's death and served part of the Regency Council to Henry's infant son, who became the new king. Of course, not everyone was a fan of Henry V, as is often the case when a new ruler takes power, especially one so young. There are people who see it as an opportunity to sow the seeds of chaos, thinking that the unestablished, inexperienced king will be a bit of a pushover. There are two such instances during Henry's reign that we should cover before getting to his shenanigans in France. First, there were the Lollards, a recent religious movement initiated by theologian John Wycliffe a few decades earlier. Up until Henry's reign, they were mostly tolerated, but he felt they were starting to gain too much traction.
So the Lollards are fascinating, and I don't want to spend a lot of time on this, but basically think about them as a precursor to what's going to happen 100 years later with the Protestant Reformation, where you have them. One of the big points of contention for the Lollards is over the sacrament of communion. In the Roman Catholic Church, the idea of transubstantiation, which is that the body and bread, or the bread physically becomes the body of Jesus, the wine physically becomes the blood of Jesus. The Lollards would say, well, no, it's symbolic. It's not. But that was considered heresy that was punishable by death, burning at the stake. They also complained about a lot of other things. And for one thing, they wanted the wealth of the church to be taken away from the church. So, there's a lot of people in the church who see the Lollards as a threat. And they're the spiritual ancestors of the likes of Martin Luther.
He wanted to stop their momentum by arresting some of their more prominent members. Instead, the Lollards decided to fight back, and an uprising took place in 1414, led by one of Henry's closest friends, Sir John Oldcastle. Previously, the king had even stayed Oldcastle's execution when he had been sentenced to death for heresy, but for the night, his beliefs trumped his friendship with the king. He had a few hundred conspirators try to sneak into Henry's palace in disguise, but their poorly planned plot had already been uncovered by the king's spies, and they proved no match for the troops waiting for them. Oldcastle himself managed to escape, while his co-conspirators were all hanged or burned at the stake. But his freedom was only temporary. 3 years later, Oldcastle was captured and executed by being burned alive over a slow fire. Lovely. The other conspiracy against Henry V took place in 1414 and was known as the Southampton Plot or the Cambridge Plot, named after its main instigator, Richard of Coinsborough, 3rd Earl of Cambridge.
And this is in that same line, the Yorkist line. In fact, I want to pull up a family tree real quick and talk about some of these people. Okay, so it all starts with Edward III. Let's zoom in a little bit here. And you see the York branch goes down through Edmund of Langley, Duke of York, to Richard of Coinsborough, who is the guy we're talking about here, who's going to be executed as part of the Southampton Plot. And then it's through him that you're going to get Richard, Duke of York. And through that Richard, Duke of York, you're going to get Edward IV. You're going to get George, the Duke of Clarence. You're going to get Richard, who's going to become Richard III, Duke of Gloucester. So you get kings there. And then, of course, Edward IV's daughter is going to become the wife of Henry VII. And therefore the mother of Henry VIII, and that, of course, is all over on this side. You got the Mortimers right here, which those claims kind of merge. The York branch and then the Mortimer branch, they merge into Richard, the Duke of York, who dies during the Wars of the Roses and is the father of Edward IV and Richard III. Now you have the Lancaster branch. This is John of Gaunt. His son is Henry IV. His son's Henry V. His son's Henry VI. But then you have John of Gaunt's initially illegitimate children, the Beauforts, who are later legitimized, and it's through them you get Margaret Beaufort, who's the mother of Henry Tudor, who becomes Henry VII. So that's just kind of a condensed version of all of this.
Lord Scrope and Sir Thomas Grey were noblemen still loyal to the former king Richard II, who believed that his heir, the aforementioned Edmund Mortimer, was the rightful king of England.
And not only that, but a lot of these rebellions would actually claim that Richard II was still alive. and they were fighting to restore him to the throne. That was kind of their figurehead that they used. Despite the fact that when Richard II had died, probably from being starved to death, his body had been paraded through the streets so that everyone could see he was actually dead.
Their plan was to assassinate Henry, thus paving the way for Mortimer to claim the throne. They didn't get a chance to establish how they were actually going to do this because their little intrigue was soon exposed to the king by none other than Edward Mortimer himself. As we said, the former heir had consigned himself to the role of sidekick. As soon as he was informed of the plot, he was like, I want nothing to do with this, you people are going to get me killed. So he went straight to the king and told him everything, swearing that he had nothing to do with it. Fortunately for him, the king believed him. As far as the other three were concerned, though, despite calls for clemency, it was off with their heads. Now the matter...
Yeah, in fact, if you watch the movie The King, or, the Shakespeare version of this, there's this dramatic scene where Timothée Chalamet, as Henry V, tells Scroop and Cambridge, I'm going to send you as my messengers to the French to let them know we're going to war. You're going to be my advance messengers to hell because tomorrow you're going to have your heads cut off.
In England had been settled, Henry V was finally able to do what he'd always been wanting to do ever since he was still a counsellor for his father: invade France. Henry's war against France was part of the larger conflict between the two nations known as the 100 Years' War, which, despite its name, actually went on for 116 years. It also wasn't one continuous fight, but rather a series of wars separated by truces. When Henry invaded France in 1415, there had been peace between the two sides for over 25 years, ever since the time of his grandfather, John of Gaunt, who also spent most of his adult life fighting the French. The whole affair kicked off thanks to Henry's great-grandfather, King Edward III of England, who said in 1340 that he had the rightful claim to the French throne. This was the kind of complicated and incestuous web of bloodlines that the European royals were really good at weaving, but the gist of it was that Edward III had been the closest male relative to the deceased French king, but he was related through his maternal line. The French, however, wanted someone related through a male bloodline, so instead they chose Philip VI as their...
And part of the complication here is that the French are relying on a law that they had never bothered to claim before. It's called Salic law. But now it became very convenient when you had an English king claiming the throne to say, oh, wait a second, no, he can't claim the throne. We have this law that says you can't inherit through a female, even though they had never really said anything about that for centuries. So Edward III claims the throne. The English king's coat of arms actually has the coat of arms of both England and France. Whenever people refer to the King of England, they're saying, King by the Edward III by the grace of God, King of England, France, and Lord of Ireland, and stuff like that. That would be a part of his title.
New King of France. Ever since then, the English kings who followed Edward III gave themselves the unofficial title of King of France, just to signify that they had not abandoned their claim, and that the guy who actually ruled France was just keeping the throne warm for them. When Henry V took power, he decided that he didn't want his title to be merely honorific, so once matters were settled in England, he gathered his army and crossed the Channel in 1415. His first target was the port town of Harfleur. It was a small but important settlement, so it was heavily fortified and was able to withstand the English siege for over a month before its inevitable surrender on September the 22nd.
Now remember, England does have, so they have Calais, for example, which is a fortified English town and will be for a long time after this. England, during the reign of King John, when he inherits the throne, had controlled large chunks of territory in France that they had to pay homage to the French king for.
Despite being a military loss, the siege of Harfleur was a boon for the French. For starters, it gave the French king, Charles VI, time to muster his troops, but it also allowed a deadly wave of dysentery to spread and wreak havoc through the English ranks. Casualty estimates are all over the map, but they could have totaled a maximum of 5,000 soldiers from both disease and fighting. Considering that Henry's initial army was slightly over 11,000 troops, that meant that he probably lost at least a third, up to almost half of his army, just besieging this little town.
Until the 20th century, disease is the main killer of people in war. It's always been that way. You get all of those men in one place in a camp, and you don't have a real great understanding of sanitation and how this stuff spreads, and things like dysentery just run rampant.
All of a sudden, Henry's dream of conquering France seemed dead in the water. But then something happened that bestowed Henry the reputation as one of the greatest military commanders in English history. With his army decimated, the king was forced to abandon his plan of attacking Paris. Instead, Henry wanted to march to Calais and retreat to England to regroup.
People forget that Agincourt happened while Henry was retreating, and he ends up getting trapped on one side of the river. I think the Somme River, I think, and he's got two French armies that are kind of angling for him. And he finally has to turn and face one of them.
Boss had no intention of letting him leave quietly. They saw their opportunity to crush their foe, and they were absolutely going to take it. They met the English army at Agincourt. There is no definitive source on the size of the French army. Some claim 12,000, others all the way up to 30,000. Suffice to say that it was significantly larger than what Henry was working with, so the Frenchmen...
And not just larger, but most of Henry's army is made up of archers, of longbowmen, whereas the French army is heavily cavalry and armored foot soldiers. Just even if the numbers were equal, the French would have been seen as having a huge advantage.
Military leaders regarded this fight as a mere bagatelle. On October the 25th, 1415, Henry proved them very, very wrong.
So what's fascinating about this, and this is how things used to be done, there's actually a letter that is sent to Henry saying, hey, we've got a French army here, we want to fight you, you choose the time and place and let's fight. And they basically say, okay, let's set a date and kind of like, let's make arrangements for our armies to come have a battle. And Henry does, and this is something that's shown in Shakespeare, he does actually challenge the Dauphin, who is the kind of the like the French version of the Prince of Wales. He's the heir to the throne. He challenges the Dauphin to single combat and says, hey, let's not let our armies fight. Let's do this one-on-one. And the Dauphin's like, well, I've got a better army. I've got a massive advantage. There's no way I would do that.
Start with the battlefield. Although we're not sure of the exact location of the battle, witness accounts said that Henry lured the French army into the narrowest section of the field, wedged between two wooded areas in order to make it harder for them to maneuver. Movement was also heavily impeded by thick and slippery mud caused by heavy rains. There, knowing that the French had a strong cavalry, Henry erected a row of sharp stakes in front of his soldiers to...
So Henry had actually had anticipated this a while back, and it wasn't just the night before or even 2 days before, a week or so before this. He had instructed all of his men to make stakes that were sharpened on either end, knowing he was going to have to face off against French cavalry and knowing he's dealing mostly with an army of his own that is heavily with men just with bows and arrows and not heavy armor. And so they've been carrying these things around knowing they were going to need them. And he sets his army up with kind of his strongest soldiers in the middle, and then he puts a lot of bowmen in either side in these woods and kind of facing off in this open area. But the French know that this is happening, and their plan is actually to attack those flanks first and then hit the middle. Well, it doesn't work out for them.
Stop the enemy's charge. Finally, he employed his secret weapon, the longbow. In past battles, the English longbow had proven to be devastatingly effective, so the French knights had no choice but to wear heavy armor that was thick enough to stop the arrows from piercing through. The battle that was supposed to be a gimme for the French soon turned into an absolute bloodbath. The rank-and-file soldiers were swiftly decimated by the never-ending hail of arrows, whereas the heavily armored men-at-arms were exhausted from moving through the muddy terrain, and those who fell down found it almost impossible to get up again. Indeed.
Think about this for a second. You got, let's say, 5,000 longbowmen. That's given you the opportunity in the span of a minute to put up 50, 60,000 arrows into the sky. So, it's not, most of them aren't going to go through that heavy armor, but they're going to disrupt. They're going to hit horses who are also armored, but probably not as well armored. You're going to have men that are going to get hit in places where the armor is weak. The heavy armor is going to slow them down. It's going to make them tired. You've got mud. Everything worked against the French in this battle.
Indeed, a large part of the French army had not been killed by sharp English steel, but by being suffocated in the mud or getting trampled by friendly forces. When it was all said and done, Henry stood triumphant next to a giant pile of corpses that numbered up to 6,000 Frenchmen, whereas he only lost a few hundred soldiers himself. It was an overwhelming victory any way that you looked at it, but Henry still didn't have an army big enough to take full advantage of it. Instead, he returned to England, where he...
So, in the aftermath of this battle, we should talk about this for a minute. Remember, I mentioned earlier there were actually 2 French armies, and the French had been waiting for reinforcements to come from the other force. And you have a heavy contingent in this French army of noblemen, some of the most important, highest ranking members of the nobility in France who are killed or captured in this battle. And rumors start to circulate among the English army that there's another French force that's coming. And so Henry has a choice to make. And he can try to get out of there. He can try to haul off all these noblemen and maybe ransom them later and make a lot of much needed money, because it's expensive to have an expeditionary force in France. And they're bleeding the country dry with taxes to pay for all of this. But he makes the decision to execute on the spot all of these noblemen that they've captured, with a couple of exceptions. And that's going to be used against him as propaganda to say what an evil person he is that he did this. But if you consider the facts on the ground, he hears there's another army coming. He has to make a split-second decision. He makes a decision to do that.
He was greeted as a hero and began making preparations for a new invasion. In early 1417, Henry was ready to travel to France again. This time there were no hair-raising, skin-of-the-teeth moments. Instead, the king preferred a systematic series of sieges of strategically important cities on his way to Paris. It took a lot longer and was nowhere near as exciting, but it was effective nonetheless. Yep. By 1419, Henry had taken Caen, Normandy, and Rouen, and Paris seemed like an inevitability.
In some of these places that he has taken, like Rouen, I think Caen basically gets completely destroyed. I mean, it's scorched earth, some of these battles, because they're brutal and they're holding out. And remember, Henry sees himself as the rightful king of France. Therefore, these are his subjects. And the fact that they're holding out and not submitting to him is, in his view, an act of rebellion that should be punished severely. He's actually also got along with him some French nobles that he's captured, that he holds in captivity. He's got the young King James of Scotland, and there are a lot of Scots that are fighting with the French. And so King James is like, he'll parade him out and tell these towns where these Scottish men are fighting, hey, I'm the king of Scots. You're fighting against your king. Now stop fighting. And they wouldn't do it, and so they would be punished severely as well. But yeah, he conquers cities that have never been conquered by the English at any point during this 100 Years' War.
It was aided by the fact that the French were dealing with their own internal strifes and struggles for power. Just because they'd a common enemy did not mean that all the various French factions played nice with each other. Quite the opposite, in fact. The Duke of Burgundy, one of the most powerful men in the country, favoured a diplomatic treaty with Henry. Because of this, he was assassinated in 1419 by his enemies, and his son, Philip the Good, allied himself with England and helped to negotiate a treaty between Henry and Charles VI, the King of France.
Yeah, in fact, when John the Fearless is murdered at this supposedly peace meeting that's taking place between French factions, this actually gives Henry V the impetus to pursue the French throne. Up until this point, he has not necessarily anticipated that he's going to take the throne of France. In fact, he's been willing to negotiate and say, you know what, I'll drop my claim on the throne of France in exchange for huge chunks of French territory that I feel are rightfully mine, like Normandy, for example. But now, after the death of the Duke of Burgundy, now he's going for it all. He wants the throne.
On May the 21st, 1420, England and France signed the Treaty of Troyes. Charles VI disinherited his eldest son, the Dauphin Charles VII, and married his daughter, Catherine of Valois, to Henry, who became the new regent of France.
And by this point, Henry V is in his 30s, and he's not married and hasn't produced an heir. One of the reasons why is for a long time he's been holding out for Catherine of Valois. She's much younger than him. When they first start talking about marriage, he's like near 20, and she's like an adolescent, like she's not even of age yet. And so it's only very close to the end of Henry's life that he finally marries Catherine of Valois, and their son will inherit the thrones of England and France. But Henry is basically made regent of France. He rules the country even though he's not named the king.
his bloodline recognized as a rightful successor to the French throne. In other words, Charles was allowed to remain king while he lived, but once he bit the dust, the crown went to Henry or his sons. On paper, Henry had accomplished his goals. However, he knew that actually getting the treaty enforced was another matter. Because there was an ongoing power struggle in France, some factions had allied themselves with the Dauphin, and some kept fighting the English, hoping to reinstate Charles VII as the heir. They even brought in the Scottish on their side, since they were always down to kill a few Englishmen. This left Henry no choice but to return to France in 1429 for his third military campaign. This one...
Not 1429, 1421, because he's dead in 1429.
However, would prove to be his last. At first, things went well. Henry once again adopted the safer strategy of prolonged sieges until his opponents surrendered. But just like at half...
I should pause here, too, and mention that Henry goes back to England. He takes Catherine with him. That's when she gets pregnant with the son who will become Henry VI. And Henry's brother Thomas is running things in France. And Thomas gets defeated in this disastrous battle that claims not only Thomas, but a bunch of other top English noblemen as well. And that's what draws Henry back over across the channel to fight again.
Fleur, dysentery swept through the English camp, and the king himself fell prey to its noxious clutches. Ultimately, it wasn't the arrows or swords of his enemies that befell King Henry V, but a lethal illness which took his life suddenly on August the 31st, 1422. Henry was only 35 years old at the time of his death, and he was quickly followed by the French king, who died 2 months later. This meant that his infant son, Henry VI, became the new king of England and France. But as you might expect, a lot of people weren't too keen on the idea, so the 100 Years' War resumed once more.
Yeah, you have an infant child on the throne who is eventually going to display some of the same madness of his grandfather, Charles VI. And this is why I said at the beginning, imagine if Henry V had lived another 10 or 15 years. He dies at 35. He dies just barely before King Charles, and so he would have become King of France if he had lived another 2 months. If he had ruled and continued to win victories, he could have solidified that. Things might have been far different if Henry VI doesn't inherit the throne until he's, say, in his 20s.
So I hope you enjoyed today's video. Quick,
all right, so I guess we're wrapping it up
if you enjoyed
right
today's
there. With that, that's just an overview of a really, really fascinating period of history. The more I learn about Henry V, the more I am fascinated and wanting to learn even more about Henry V, if you understand what I mean by that. But let me know your thoughts. Use the comment section below. I want to thank Josh in Kansas City, Missouri, and Christian in Hattiesburg, Mississippi for your support on Patreon. Really appreciate it. Thanks for watching.